Kokota, all of you and everybody who's come to visit has had to put up with all the construction that's going on. And I know that we've all wondered from time to time, is this ever going to end? But it's got a stay many years ago from J.E. Goodnow, who did most of the things that we see around Kokota are his doing, and they've lasted through all these years. But he did it to honor a very unique individual, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So his name was Platt, and he was born in Hoosick, New York, May 6th of 1813. When he was 2 years old, his family moved to a farm. In some places you'll see written that his family was very, very poor, etc. But I don't think they were. I think they were of moderate means. But they moved to a brand new farm as the country was moving west. The soil was extremely poor, and it was very heavily timbered. So he learned early to work very hard. He had almost no formal education. Until he was 14 years old, there were no schools in his area. There had been kind of a warfare about the schoolhouse site. They built a school, but there was a lot of contention about where and when and what. And once it was built, it was burned. And they think that one of the contenders is the person that built it down. They finally built another school. It was open 3 months in the summer and 3 months in the winter. And that was all the education he had. And during that time, he just attended sporadically. He learned to read well enough to read a little of the Bible, read a little of the newspaper, but that was about it. He worked hard. He worked at multiple jobs. And when he was 21 years old, he opened a mercantile store. It was really quite successful, but then came the financial crash of 1837, and he lost everything that he had gained and worked so hard for, and ended up $47 in debt. And again, he found himself working as a farmhand, a carpenter, a mechanic, a store clerk. So as we would say, he was a jack of all trades. Well, in 1839, very long time ago, you remember the Bellevue War was in 1840. That kind of gives you a little context. In 1839, at the age of 26, he came to Jackson County. And we were the frontier. We were indeed the Wild West. So he worked at anything he could. He was a millwright. He rafted lumber out the Mississippi. He clerked in stores. But the first 2 years he was there, he was plagued with ague. And that's a disease that today we think of as being sort of like malaria. He would have periodic episodes of violent fever and shaking, and he really, really suffered for that very long time. And during this time, remember, there was little here. There were hardly any houses. There was very, very little. And so during this time, he was cared for by J.E. Goodnow and his family, and he lived with them. And he had to have lived with them in that little log cabin that was on the corner of Main and Platt Street. Come on, little guy. My mouse. Thank you, Sally. Okay, so a few years later, it would have been while he was still living with them, J.E. Goodnow built this cabin. You've all seen the drawing of the cabin. There were no photographs. During this time he lived with them, he must have helped to build this cabin. This is the cabin that was at the corner of Main Street and Pleasant Street, right? Where the green space is now. The cabin was there. And it was used for a blacksmith shop. That's why he originally built it. And then in 1841, there's a newspaper article that said that at that time, in 1841, it was turned into the schoolhouse. So a lot of things happened in that log cabin. Then J.E. Goodnow, sometime between 1846 and 1849, maybe it took that long, J.E. Goodnow, where the log cabin stood, built his large brick hotel. Platt Smith would have stayed there as well, because he was still here during that time. And he would have attended the meetings that were there, because the movers and the shakers of this area, the people that were forming the state government of Iowa, because we weren't a state yet, the people that were forming that, well, we were a state, sorry. The people that were forming that all met at Goodno's Hotel. Once in a while they met at the Butterworth Inn, once in a while they met at the Buckhorn Inn, but those were the only three places in our area that had room for a meeting of people. So all these important political figures, etc., would come to this hotel, and you see it there on the corner of Main and Platt Street. Well, according to the Jackson County Directory of 1878, Maquoketa really began to flourish around 1842. And listen to this. In 1842, Maquoketa had a mill, a store, one store, a post office, a blacksmith shop, hotel, and that was it. The 1875 Andreessen Atlas, that has so much good history in it, talks about the fact that in 1842, Mr. Smith bought the mill that had been erected by J. Goodnow, put in bolts, and made bolted flour. And that was the first time that the people in Maquoketa had good flour. The flour wasn't bolted, it was really lumpy and wasn't very good for baking. Well, other history books of our area say that in 1842, Joseph McCloy was the one who did this. So maybe in between that, there's some history that we haven't found, but that'd be a great research project for somebody. Only a couple small pictures of Platt Smith have ever been found, and so it's difficult to know what he would look like. But you remember in the programs that we've had about Anson Wilson, who always was very practical, who always told the truth as he saw it and never ever exaggerated. Anson Wilson remembered him as a big man. A writer from the Illinois Central Railroad described him as a huge and picturesque figure. So, but when he was in Jackson County, when he was living here, he met and married a lady by the name of Caroline Livermore. They had a son named George, who died in the first year of his life, and then later they had a son named Elmer. Carolyn died in 1875, and at that time he was in the process of building her a new house. And you see the house way at the top of that hill in Dubuque. So supposedly, according to the Encyclopedia Dubuque, that is 961 Bluff Street, where he built his house, and she died while he was building it. Caroline, we think, and I didn't do enough research, sorry, to find out, I think she was the daughter of Sam Livermore, who owned much of what was now the First Ward Park, etc., the northeast section of what was to become Maquoketa. And after she died in 1872, then he married Janet Moreland Barton, a lady from Dubuque. Okay, so back again to when Platt Smith arrived in Jackson County. As we said, he could barely read. A little bit of the newspaper, a little bit of the Bible. He could only scrawl his signature. He could not write. In 1840, he made friends with J.E. Goodnow, and he met the people who were who's who of early Iowa. He was just thrown in with all of these people, and he began to learn, and he began to learn quickly. And he also, quite by accident, began to practice law. So you wonder, how can somebody who can't read and write practice law? Well, at this time, there were no lawyers in Maquoketa, and there were no law books in Maquoketa. We had a justice of the peace that took care of things. And it happened that during this time, and we've kind of talked about this before, there was an elderly man from Dubuque by the name of David Harrington. And he had come to Jackson County, bought some land, and built his little cabin on the land. Well, this land was also claimed by a very important man by the name of Mr. Doolittle. Mr. Doolittle had come here from Cincinnati, and he was a partner of David Sears, who built the little village of Lowell with all the flour mill, the saw mill, the woolen mill, the grist mill. And together, the two men owned hundreds of acres of land. So here was little David Harrington facing the people that had a lot of wealth and a lot of land. Doolittle tried to knock down his cabin, and old Mr. Harrington struck him with his cane. So Doolittle sued him for forcible entry and detainer before the Justice of the Peace in Maquoketa. The old man asked Platt Smith to help him in this dispute against the much better educated Doolittle, who was a fine public speaker and sort of felt that he knew a lot about the law. Well, it turned out that Mr. Harrington made an excellent choice. So when they went before the court, Platt Smith told the story of Solomon and how the two women were quarreling over the child, and Solomon drew his sword and said that he'd give each woman half, and then the real mother quickly gave up the baby rather than to see it harmed. Well, in like manner, this court found for the defendant, holding that Harrington was the one party that had no desire to damage the property that they were talking about. So, if you remember the history of Lowell and Sears and Doolittle, we know that they were trying to finish the first sawmill on the South Fork of the Maquoketa River, and they had to forego that plan because they lost a legal dispute. Well, that was the legal dispute that they lost. So they had to move further on down the river, and that's how they began the mills at what we know as Lowell. But in the process of all this, our friend Platt Smith became the people's hero because he defended the little guy against the powerful, right? He was automatically a celebrity. Well, Mr. Doolittle, who had been beaten in court, was a good sport about the loss, and after the trial, he sought out Smith, talked to him for 2 or 3 hours, and offered to help him get a legal education. He could see great promise. And he also sent back to Cincinnati for law books, and Platt began reading the law books that would make him a counselor of railroad tycoons and counselor, and he eventually was admitted to practice before the Supreme Court of the United States. This man who came here not able to read or write. Well, in the meantime, our little Mr. Harrington, the old man whose cabin he saved, was delighted with his victory, and he began bragging about Smith all over Maquoketa and all over Bellevue. And almost immediately, this new lawyer, who wasn't really a lawyer, got permission from Harry Hopkins, a Bellevue lawyer, to clerk and read in his law office. So that's how you became a lawyer back then. You read and clerked for another lawyer. Smith arrived in Bellevue, which was, remember then, the county seat, and had 2 lawyers. And he arrived there with the books that he acquired from Doolittle, and he started his career. Well, his fame did spread quickly. In 2 days, he was asked to do another land claim, and then another, and then another. And he was even winning cases against Hopkins and Moss, the men he was learning under. So they were the only attorneys in Bellevue. And from then on, Platt Smith became the attorney of choice in this whole area. The first case he took, he made, since coming to the territory, he made $25. And that's the most money he had had. And so he was elated, and he had agreed to saw wood, cords of wood, for this lawyer in Bellevue, Hopkins, in payment for, space in his office and that sort of thing. He cut his first cord of wood, and that's the last wood he ever had to cut, because then financially he could afford to spend his time on his cases and studying his newfound law books. So, though just claims was just one narrow area of the law back then, it allowed him to hone his considerable persuasive abilities and become familiar with courtroom procedures, and he very quickly became a tough and effective apprentice of frontier law. So we know that back in 1840, when men came west, they had to move quickly if they were given an opportunity to develop a career. So Platt Smith decided that he was going to become a member of the Dubuque Bar. He went to Dubuque, he watched the court in action for a couple days, and then he asked permission to be examined for admission to the court. Well, the other lawyers and judges refused him on the grounds of insufficient training. And one man, thinking he was being really, really kind, offered him an apprenticeship as a harness maker. Well, he was a little taken back by that, and he declined, saying that his intention was to become a lawyer. Well, this is all according to the Dubuque Herald. He then returned, he was kind of taken back, but he could understand. He then returned to his old friend, J.E. Goodnow, and once again lived in Maquoketa. His friends here were shocked and astonished because they saw him as this great hero, couldn't believe that he had been refused admission to the bar. He repaid Doolittle for the law books that he had purchased for him, and he took passage on a raft of lumber that ran out of a big Maquoketa destined for Muscatine. And he was paying for his passage by piloting the craft over the Rock Island Rapids. Once he got there, he hired a horse and he went to Tipton. And in Tipton was a man by the name of Joseph Williams. And he was the judge of the court. The court was in session. He had changed his clothes in Muscatine. And he had left his wallet in those clothes. So he was in that way. He watched the court for a few minutes, and then he introduced himself to this man, Ralph P. Lowe. And he was governor. He ended up being governor and chief justice of the state. And he asked him if he could borrow $10 and request admission to the bar. He took the examination, and he obtained a certificate of admission dated March 27. Then he returned to Muscatine. He paid his debt to the judge's partner, who was in Muscatine, and again returned to Maquoketa, back home to the Goodnows. He waited until the first Monday of April, when the court sat at the Jackson County Courthouse that was then in Andrew. Andrew was at that time the county seat. And the judge, who a few days earlier had denied him the examination at the bar in Dubuque, was the judge. And he was very surprised to see Mr. Smith listed as counsel in 35 out of the 42 cases on the docket before him. He accepted Smith's explanation of how he became a member of the bar, and they worked together and they disposed of the cases in 5 days. So the judge could go home, and he was forever a good friend of Platt Smith. Well, by the mid-1840s, so we're still really, really early here, by the mid-1840s, he switched from claims cases to criminal defense. Big difference. According to the 1875 Atlas, he first assisted his lawyer friend from Bellevue, Henry Hopkins, where he had read law and clerked, remember. He helped him in the prosecution of a murder case. A man named Jackson was accused of the murder of Zophyr Perkins. And Jackson was convicted and hung in Andrew from that old hanging tree. But very soon, Platt Smith began regretting helping in this case, because he came to believe later that it was very possible that this was not murder but self-defense. And knowing how he felt, he never again prosecuted a man for murder. But during the next 8 years, he was hired to defend a great majority of all the criminal cases that were tried in our district, and some in adjoining states even, because his reputation had spread. And in all those cases, no one was ultimately convicted. No one was sentenced, and no one was even fined. Sometimes he tried 7 or 8 murder cases in 1 year. In one instance, there were 4 such cases in 4 consecutive weeks in 4 different counties. So when you're riding horseback or in horse and buggy, going all these places, preparing, that was a real feat. Frequently, he defended 2 or 3 Indians in the same week. Well, excitement, as you can imagine, in murder cases ran very high. Public meetings were frequently held, and in Jackson County especially, there was a great effort to denounce Smith and his clients, because the culprits were always set free, and people were, hey, what's going on here kind of thing. But there was a reason, and the reason was that Platt Smith very carefully studied his case before he took the case on. And if it was a case where he could see that the person was guilty, he just passed that case on to other lawyers, and he didn't take them. But if there was room for doubt, and he thought that probably the person was innocent, he took the case. We're told that about half of the cases that he took paid very small fees. A large portion of them paid nothing. But once in a while, there was a case that paid well. But it didn't matter to him. If there was reasonable doubt of guilt of the defendant, the case was given his complete attention, whether the person could afford to pay or not. Okay, so this man is Judge Williams, and he is the judge that he went to at Tipton that admitted him to the bar. Well, criminal defense was a difficult area in the Wild West. As you know, we had vigilante groups, all kinds of we had hanging trees, all kinds of things went on. And to do criminal law, you had to become very skillful. And any man who succeeded in challenging the shotgun law of early Iowa wasn't likely to be daunted by confrontations with the Supreme Court or railroad magnates or anyone else. So according to the Olympus, and I know I don't say that right, Platt Smith was not only working his way into Dubuque law, he was making useful and important contacts. People like Judge Williams here, who examined him at Tipton. He was a very influential person. Okay, this is the Jackson County Courthouse at Andrew, the second courthouse, actually probably the third courthouse. In 1846 to 1847, Williams and T.C. Wilson, who we just saw pictures of, Wilson, by the way, became Platt Smith's future partner. Those two men became justices of the Iowa Supreme Court. Very, very powerful. They were known as the Andrew Clique. They were the Andrew Clique of lawyers and officials because they held the political power in territorial Iowa. We were still a territory. Smith's connections now included these men, as well as the Goodnoes and Ralph Law and Hopkins and Moss of Bellevue. He was getting to know all the right people, and he was learning from them. So this is Thomas Wilson. So 1846, you remember, Iowa became a state in December, I believe, and things did begin to calm down. Wasn't quite so wild and woolly. And in the mid-1840s, Platt had become tired of criminal law, and he had decided to switch to civil cases. So now he was doing civil law, not trying murder cases. And in 1847, finally, he was admitted to the Dubuque bar, so he could legally try cases in Dubuque. And in 1848, he went into partnership with Judge Wilson. And these two men financed the Globe building in downtown Dubuque. I tried to find a picture of the Globe building in downtown Dubuque. I wasn't able to find one, but evidently, for back in that day, it was a big, huge building. Well, in 1853, Smith, who had been admitted to practice before the United States Supreme Court, argued two extremely important cases in front of them. And they set the firm legal base for the development of Dubuque as a center of business and communication. One had to do with Spanish land grants, and that was brought by the heirs of Julian Dubuque. And the other involved rights of the ferry line across the river. And these two cases set the way for the growth of new railroads. The Jackson Press of 12/21/83 that you see here, 1853, as you see here, announced that Wilson and Smith had left for Washington, D.C. They had been sent to defend the interests of Dubuque, and the city council had given them each $1,000 for their services. $1,000 was a lot of money back then. Platt Smith, in 1853, shared in the founding then of the Dubuque and Pacific Railroad. So as railroads became the thing, he found another area that he was going to excel in. Dubuque and Pacific Railroad. He was their first attorney. He drew up the Articles of Incorporation. He handled the stock subscriptions, and he procured the right-of-way they had to buy, wherever the track went, they had to buy land from the farmer or whoever owned it. He went in person and took care of each and every one of these things. And court cases would come up where people would fight against this. In the cases that came up, he himself had 36, which was the majority, and he argued them all in person. But the change from civil law, where he made a lot of money, to the railroad business greatly decreased what he was earning. He remained with the Dubuque and Pacific Railroad, became the president for a time until it reached Iowa Falls. Then he organized the Iowa Falls and Sioux City Railroad, and he was a director of the Sioux City and Pacific, and he was the first to start and organize 4 or 5 other railroads along the way. In 1868, Platt helped to found the Dubuque and the Rager line, and later the Dubuque, Bellevue, and Mississippi line. So that's our Andrew Carnegie. As you know, Andrew Carnegie donated the money for our wonderful library downtown in Maquoketa and thousands of libraries across the country. But there was an interesting story in 1868 of Platt Smith's meeting with Andrew Carnegie. He was then a member of the board of directors of the Dubuque Bridge Company. Carnegie was there trying to sell them high-quality steel to build this bridge across the Mississippi. But the directors thought that cheaper cast iron was going to be good enough. They built it of cast iron instead of Carnegie steel. Carnegie recorded in his autobiography that he was losing this battle until a big man with a long, stern face spoke up. And he said that he had been driving his buggy the night before, and he had struck a lamppost, and the lamppost had snapped in two. It was made of cast iron. Well, Carnegie, being a smart man, never missed a chance, and he quickly asked the others to consider what would happen if their wonderful cast iron bridge was struck by a riverboat. And that made a great impression. And they took a vote, and the bridge was built of high-quality Carnegie iron. Carnegie said that he had seen the hand of providence in the work of Platt Smith as he came to his aid. Well, and that was quite the bridge, the first bridge across the river in Dubuque. So this is just a photograph of downtown Dubuque during the latter years that Platt Smith would have lived there. After 1870, he kept up his interest in all of his Dubuque projects. He was very important in Dubuque. But for the 15 years that he was concentrating on railroads, starting all these railroads, he had become almost entirely disconnected from the law. He occasionally took a case, receiving a fee of anywhere from $1,000 to $16,000. And he did some limited legal work, but he basically lived off his stock income. And all this time he seems to have been a vocal advocate for the temperance movement. So this is the Jackson County Courthouse, as you can see, built in 1873. The county seat moved to Maquoketa and into this courthouse in 1873. And it's very feasible, though I don't know for sure, but it's very feasible that in his later years, when he was doing sporadic cases, that Platt Smith probably tried some cases there as well toward the end of his career. We do know, however, that during his last few years, he was bedridden. He had strokes and paralysis, and this brought about his death July 12th of 1882. And in the very comfortable brick house at 916 Bluff Street in Dubuque, which I've seen online still stands, but I couldn't find a good picture of it. That's where he died. That's where he passed away. Now this says a brick house. The picture that we looked at before was a white house. It didn't look like a brick house, but maybe it had been painted or something. I don't know. But that's all the information I could find. Platt Smith's Odyssey, from accidental participation in a squatter's case to winning arguments before the Supreme Court, took place in less than 11 years. That's pretty remarkable. It was a great individual achievement. He was absolutely a self-taught frontier lawyer, possessed of essential qualities of vision. He had great vision, of shrewdness, and of deep common sense. And the impact of his personality and his mind on all those whom he met were ever evident. J. Goodnow was impressed, and he named the most important cross street in this town in his honor, Platt Street. I just put in a couple, oops. Okay, we're not going back, I guess. Okay, so if you, I really messed that up. Okay, we're almost done. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Okay, so that is a plan, not a plat, but a plan of Maquoketa. It's not dated, and the additions that you see where they projected the growth of Maquoketa are just that, it's a plan. Some of those streets were never built where they say they are, but it was the plan of Maquoketa moving forward. We know it's at least 1870 when this plan was made, because you can see that both railroads are there. And, I'm afraid to touch anything. Both railroads are there. So, but that was the plan of Maquoketa back in the day. I give up. But I just thought it's really nice to know that somebody like Platt Smith, who came here not, well, barely, being able to learn to read and write, could work so hard to make so much of himself. True, he didn't stay in Maquoketa, he moved on to Dubuque. But certainly living here, being with the Goodnow family, meeting the people that came through here, the people that got together at Goodnow's Hotel that formed the early government of Iowa, he was certainly a part of all of that. So I just think it's important that we know about people like Platt Smith. Thank you very much. The courthouse? Okay, it was right across, now correct me if I'm wrong, it's right across the street from the courthouse today, right? Same side of the street. The annex was across the street. Okay, same side. Between the courthouse and where Ken Wright's office was? Okay. No?
You know where the little gazebo area is? That would probably be in the front yard of the...
Where the gazebo is.
Okay.
And it's, yeah, faced on, let's see, what, 2nd Street? Yeah.
And I feel bad that this had to be torn down. I know people who work here are probably quite happy, but it was neat when we had Asher Schrader with us, because he could tell us such stories about the courthouse, and it had, you know, this beautiful staircase, and we do at the museum, we have the blueprints for the courthouse, which is pretty neat, but it was an awesome building, and I'm sorry that it's not still standing. Any other questions that I can't answer? Archie?
How many generations are between the original J.E. Goodnow and the one that we're all familiar with?
Whoa, that's a good question. Whoa. J. Goodnow, I can't remember the year he died, but it was in the, like 1915, sometime around there. So how many would that be? So we have Jack Goodnow here still, is that correct? Jack Goodnow still?
Don't look at me, I wasn't scared of that.
I think so. He would be kind of the only one that's still here.
Frank Goodnow too.
And Frank's here. Okay. Oh! So Richard found out online that I couldn't find, 961 Bluff Street in Dubuque, and it is a 2-story brick house. Very nice house, and it obviously is still there. Thank you. Okay, I don't know for sure, Archie, how many generations, but it was probably...
My grandparents, great-grandparents came in 1837.
1837?
That'd be great-grandparents.
So that would be 5, would that be right? think maybe 5,
That's
6.
for
Five to
Platt
six.
Smith.
But I think he's just one of the incredible stories.
In the old courthouse, wasn't the license, driver's license bureau upstairs?
Yeah.
Climbing all them wooden steps?
Yep, climbed all those wooden steps, but they were beautiful wooden steps, right? But you did. And the county superintendent of schools was up there, I believe. And we have some of the furniture that was in the courthouse, some big long tables and things, at the other museum, big heavy tables.
So when was it moved to the new building?
1873. 1873.
So that was built in 1873, but when did the present courthouse?
Oh, when was the present courthouse
Yeah.
built? In 1957 or 8. The new courthouse was built. So, yeah.
Still got 90 days, didn't it?
Yeah. Thank you so much.